few religious sentiments of the world have been met with the level of neglect, dismissal, or outright disinterest as that of the various tribes of the American native. However much it has become suitable for modern enthusiasts to regard the subject of Native Americans exclusively with pity and lamentation on account of the atrocities committed against them, this attitude too often becomes the sole focus, overshadowing how hard the natives fought against the colonists for centuries, and how difficult it actually was for French and British soldiers to elude and defeat them in battle. The periods of peaceable consort between tribespeople and the European are also often ignored in favor of a discussion solely oriented to how hard the natives lost and how sad we should all feel about it. But when it comes to honoring their beliefs and wondering about the world they lived in and the spirits and visions they met with, we are suddenly mute, or otherwise caused to regard the Indian as a kind of fairy folk who didn't express their fair share of human nature. For us modern Americans, who so often ship over one or another desert religion into this country of forested mountains and fertile valleys, it's past time to honor the divinity so anciently recognized in America and dial back this hopeless dialogue of doom, gloom, and self-hatred. It is one thing to lament the tragedies of history, and entirely another to attempt to peer into the native worldview and consider that they lived and breathed a religion of their own and connected with the spirits of the countryside in a manner increasingly alien to the hyper-rationalist Westerner. The purpose of this essay, then, is to probe various first-hand accounts of Native American religion, if we may use such a term, with a special focus on the shamanic holy men, powwows, magicians, and healers among them. In more colorful phrase, the wizards of Native America. What facts and accounts we have of the early North American Indian come by way of various men of European descent, beginning in the 16th century with the Spaniard Cabeza de Vaca. It goes without saying that a great deal of these accounts were written by Christians thoroughly incapable of grappling with the native beliefs. As we will see, it was perfectly common to accuse the Indian of devil worship and demonic association whenever something occurred that confused or constipated the Christian-minded Europeans, who had already developed the long-standing, unwritten rule that may as well say, if we don't understand it, if it makes us uncomfortable, it is surely Satan. As the physician and writer of Santee Dakota descent, Charles A. Eastman, put it, the first missionaries, good men imbued with the narrowness of their age, branded us as pagans and devil worshippers, and demanded of us that we abjure our false gods before bowing the knee at their sacred altar. They even told us that we were eternally lost, unless we adopted a tangible symbol and professed a particular form of their hydra-headed faith. There are, however, hidden advantages to this bias. For when the European witnessed or heard of the occasional miracle, healing, ghost, or apparition, they were more likely to assert the involvement of the devil rather than to disregard the event outright. At the very least, there are written records of shamanic and magical activity, and these things were real, no matter what the Christian interpreted them to be. And so it is into this jungle of accounts that we enter, in an effort to peel back the veils of time and spy the wizard of North America in action. From east to west, there was the common tradition of certain members of the American Indian youth to pursue a solitary communion with the divine, like the mountain vigils of the Brule Sioux, whose young men questing for their life's meaning would consult with their holy elder, fast and endure a sweat lodge, smoke the ceremonial pipe, and, in isolation, plead for the spirits, ancestors, or the Great Spirit to commune with them. As Eastman wrote, in this holy trance or ecstasy, the Indian mystic found his highest happiness and the motive power of his existence. When he returned to the camp, he must remain at a distance until he had again entered the vapor bath and prepared himself for intercourse with his fellows. Of the vision or sign vouchsafed to him, he did not speak, unless it had included some commission which must be publicly fulfilled. Much like the Heyokas or sacred fools of the Lakota, the true Indian shaman must achieve their position through divine experience. This was not a title bestowed by a clerical hierarchy, but earned man or woman to God under the jeweled vault of the heavens. Perhaps the most accessible example is Black Elk of the Oglala Lakota, who had multiple near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, which took him through a range of bewildering and poignant visions that influenced his healing abilities, elevated him to the role of Heyoka, and left him with a lasting power and strong spiritual belief, which later was seen by first-hand witnesses to cause rain to fall from light clouds over Harney's Peak during a drought. There is certainly room to speak somewhat generally about the shamanic type among Native American tribes across the continent. As was so colorfully documented by the American painter and traveler George Catlin, it would have been more odd than not to find a well-populated tribe with a rich history that lacked the equivalent of their priestly shamanic class, and some manner of a secretive or private house or lodge in which this class took counsel for various reasons, whether in the effort to call for rain, bring in a herd of buffalo, commune with the spirit world, or discuss plans of battle against an opposing tribe. We see this among the Plains tribes of the Sioux and Cheyenne, the Chippewa of the Great Lakes and their secretive society of healers, known as the Medewewin, the Iroquois Confederacy with their false-face society that could expel malevolent spirits, the coastal Northwest tribes such as the Tlingit, who are known for their shaking tent wherein a shaman could enter to commune with the spirits and perform divinations, and the Navajo, who also, like all the aforementioned, used complex initiation rituals and ceremonies to cap off the induction of new candidates into positions of spiritual influence. Of course, there were nuances and distinctions among these rituals and shamans respective of their particular tribes, but the overarching reasons behind the importance of continuing these mostly non-hereditary lineages of healers remained the same regardless. From Eastman, we learn of a Sioux prophet predicting the coming of the white man 50 years prior to his arrival in the West, and foretelling of a fire boat which would come down the river, which was later the steamboat of the Mississippi. One prophet in particular who gave many prophecies was Tachankpi Hotanka, or His War Club Speaks Loud, who foretold the details of a war party against the Ojibways a year in advance, which turned out to be a mostly accurate precognition, aside from one ambush against the Sioux. One so-called medicine man of the Sioux, born on the Rum River, foretold in a dream at around the age of 75 years that a large war party was approaching. Scouts soon confirmed this after riding out, and they were able to set up defenses in time to repel the attack from the Ojibways. This foretelling was repeated 5 years later. In another story, we learn, quote, "The father of Little Crow, the chief who led the Minnesota Massacre of 1862, was another prophet of some note. One of his characteristic prophecies was made only a few years before he died, when he had declared that, although already an old man, he would go once more upon the warpath. At the final war feast he declared that 3 of the enemy would be slain, but he showed great distress and reluctance in foretelling that he would lose 2 of his own men. 3 of the Ojibways were indeed slain, as he had said, but in the battle, the old war prophet lost both of his 2 sons." Eastman speaks of his own grandmother, who would often point out places where the bones of fallen warriors could be found, though she had no outward signs to confirm or prior physical evidence for this knowledge. Among the American Indians, like the Dakota and the Cherokee, there was a widespread understanding about the sanctity of the dead. Among some tribes, even speaking the name of the dead, or especially insulting the dead by name, could be cause for punishment or death. Quote, many of the Indians believed that one may be born more than once, and there were some who claimed to have full knowledge of a former incarnation. There were also those who held converse with a twin spirit, who had been born into another tribe or race. In one example, a Sioux war prophet foretold that he had a twin spirit among the Ojibways, although the two spirit brothers had never met before in the flesh. And after this knowledge was successfully communicated among the Sioux in question, upon the arrival of the Ojibways and the obvious familiar of this twin spirit with the Sioux prophet, a great deal of bloodshed was prevented. Among the eastern Woodlands and Algonquin-speaking tribes, such as the Narragansett, Wampanoag, Pequot, Mohegan, and probably the Delaware, the term powwow was used to refer to the religious leader, stereotypically called medicine men by Europeans. The Englishman Edward Winslow, who voyaged on the Mayflower, once wrote, with the typical Christian bias, "The office and duty of the powwow is to be exercised principally in calling upon the devil and curing diseases of the sick or wounded. The powwow is eager and free in speech, fierce in countenance, and joined many antic and laborious gestures with the same over the party deceased." William Wood, an English colonist who lived in Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early 17th century, reported that one powwow Passaconaway could, quote, make the water burn, the rocks move, the trees dance, metamorphose himself into a flaming man. And on account of these events being written off as visual tricks, quote, he will therefore do more, for in winter, when there is no green leaves to be got, he will burn an old one to ashes, and putting those into the water produce a new green leaf, which you shall not only see but substantially handle and carry away, and make of a dead snakeskin a living snake, both to be seen, felt, and heard. These I write but upon report of the Indians, who confidently affirm stranger things. Though William Wood ascribed the devil's aid in the production of these stranger things, he confides that an honest gentleman told him a story of one powwow healing a man's foot that had been pierced by the stump of a tree, and making the foot whole after sucking out the stump through the wrapped wound. We're told the conduct of the powwow is that of divine frenzy, often taking on the characteristics of animals in the acts of healing, whether it be foaming at the mouth, roaring like a bear or a dying horse, and gyrating before an audience who chants and prays together. In the stories of the ghost dance and many other sacred dances reported in the 18th and 19th centuries, this kind of physiological disassociation was one of the primary mechanisms for inducing the visionary state, or in the case of Black Elk, an out-of-body experience. On one occasion of Black Elk's dancing with a large group in the ghost dance, he says, "Then we began dancing, and most of the people waited and cried as they danced, holding hands in a circle, but some of them laughed with happiness. While they were lying there like the dead, they were having visions, and we kept on dancing and singing, and many were crying for the old way of living, and that the old religion might be with them again. After a while I began to feel very queer. First, my legs seemed to be full of ants. I was dancing with my eyes closed, as the others did. Suddenly it seemed that I was swinging off the ground and not touching it any longer. I floated over the teepees and began to come down feet first at the center of the hoop, where I could see a beautiful tree all green and full of flowers. When I touched the ground, 2 men were coming toward me, and they wore holy shirts made and painted in a certain way. They came to me and said, 'It is not yet time to see your father, who is happy. You have work to do. We will give you something that you shall carry back to your people, and with it they shall come to see their loved ones.' I knew it was the way their holy shirts were made that they wanted me to take back. They told me to return at once, and then I was out in the air again, floating fast as before. When I came right over the dancing place, the people were still dancing, but it seemed they were not making any sound. Then I fell back into my body. As I did this, I heard voices all around and above me, and I was sitting on the ground." The English colonist and lawyer Thomas Morton describes one chief powwow who appeared to submerge into a river and immediately emerge at the other end, without being seen swimming the distance between. And more, he relates a story told, quote, likewise by our English, in the heat of summer, to make ice appear in a bowl of fair water. First, having the water set before him, he, the powwow, hath begun his incantation according to their usual custom. And before the same has ended, a thick cloud has darkened the air, and on a sudden a thunderclap hath been heard. In an instant he hath showed a firm piece of ice to float in the midst of the bowl. Quote, there are among them, wrote the writer and settler Daniel Gookin, certain men and women who they call powwows. These are partly wizards and witches, holding familiarity with Satan, that evil one, and are partly physicians, and make us, at least in show, of herbs and roots for curing the sick and diseased. And by their diabolical spells, mutterings, exorcisms, they seem to do wonders. They report also, wrote Edward Winslow, that some of them can cause the wind to blow in what part they list, can raise storms and tempests, which they usually do when they intend the death or destruction of other people. Those of us familiar with the theurgy, divination, and miracle-making around the ancient Mediterranean will have heard of like stories from Jesus, who caused a tempest to settle on the Sea of Galilee, and Pythagoras, who also apparently could speak to the occasional animal, in much the same manner as the American Indian shaman often reported communication with animals. There are frequent reports of the Indian shrewdly predicting the weather and the wind, much like the reports given by Captain James Cook during his time among the Tahiti natives of the Pacific. And even John Josselyn, an English traveler to New England, who in all other places was perfectly assured that the Indians of coastal Maine were merely consorting with the devil to perform their healings, reported that, quote, they have a remarkable observation of a flame that appears before the death of an Indian or English upon their wigwams in the dead of night. The first time that I did see it, I was called out by some of them about 12 of the clock, it being a very dark night. I perceived it plainly mounting the air over our church. From all these sources, and more, we learn that the American Indian had no doubts about the immortality of the soul, and even retained memory of a great and ancient flood, which was commemorated by the Mandan tribe of North Dakota in a sacred ceremonial. While many tribes professed theologies unique to their own, often asserting the existence of one or another evil spirit in contrast to the Creator God, the belief in the powers of the tribal wise man or wise woman was ubiquitous. And we should not think that the American Indian did not have to deal with the occasional trickster or fraudster. Far from it, as Eastman emphasizes, especially in the later times when the Indian way of life was at risk, there arose a fair amount of deceivers and false prophets, and other wise men who were accused of such when their powers seemed to fail them. George Catlin, while living with the Mandan tribes of the plains, offers a brief profile of the tribal magician and religious leader, saying, quote, these men, as I before remarked, are valued as dignitaries in the tribe, and the greatest respect is paid to them by the whole community, not only for their skill in materia medica, but more especially for their tact in magic and mysteries, in which they all deal to a very great extent. No tribe is without them. That in all tribes their doctors are conjurers, are magicians, are soothsayers, and I had like to have said high priests, inasmuch as they superintend and conduct all their religious ceremonies. They are looked upon by all as oracles of the nation. In all councils of war and peace they have a seat with the chiefs, are regularly consulted before any public step is taken, and the greatest defense and respect is paid to their opinions. George recounts the story of one type of spiritual leader that was distinguished as the Rainmaker, and even Rain Stopper. After telling his readers to cease laughing and keep a sober mind while regarding this story, he tells of his time of arrival among the Mandans, when they were all in great stress over the lack of rain. When the situation reached an extreme, the medicine men gathered in their council house in full mystery regalia, whose meeting was kept secret from all but 10 or 15 men. With a casting of lots, they would take turns standing atop the medicine lodge to test their magic and send their pleas to the heavens, offering songs and prayers to him, quote, who lives in the sun and commands the thunders of heaven. One after another failed to invoke the rains until White Buffalo's hair observed a black cloud coming on from the west. At once he exerted his magic and his pleas. He drew the eyes of the whole village upon him as he vaunted forth his superhuman powers, and at the same time commanding the cloud to come nearer, that he might draw down its contents upon the heads and the corn fields of the Mandans. My friends, it is done. Wakadahahi's arrow has entered that black cloud, and the Mandans will be wet with the water of the skies. His predictions were true. In a few moments the cloud was over the village, and the rain fell in torrents. He at length finished his vaunts and his threats, and descended from his high place, in which he had been perfectly drenched, prepared to receive the honors and the homage that were due to one so potent in his mysteries. George lived with the Mandans for a summer and achieved great honor among them for his skill in painting. He confessed that he made every effort to inquire into the essence of the Mandan mysteries, to no avail. Rather it was conveyed that these secrets and arts could not be told at all. Even if the wise men wanted to share them, it was not a thing to be bestowed by man to man, but, it seemed, by the spirits alone. George recounted this as possibly silly, and it is no surprise that this kind of thinking prevailed among Eurocentric thinkers. For instance, many stories told by the Lakota holy man Black Elk may come off as absurd unless we take the time to reconcile our doubts with the open-mindedness of the American Indian, which is a kind of faith which always offers a better opportunity for a given miracle to occur, much as when Jesus of Nazareth returned to his own hometown after performing many miracles. He could not perform them in his hometown on account of their lack of faith, reminding us of the idea that familiarity breeds contempt, whereas rarity breeds admiration. Black Elk once told of a healer who, quote, by the name of Creeping, went around among the people curing snowblinds. He would put snow upon their eyes, and after he had sung a certain sacred song that he had heard in a dream, he would blow on the backs of their heads, and they would see again, so I have heard. It was about the dragonfly that he sang, for that was where he got his power, they say. Of course we may hear that a man curing snowblinds by singing of a dragonfly is peak absurdity, unless we try to ground ourselves in the ways of the American Indian, who claimed to communicate often with many animals and insects and, in many stories, hardly needed to voyage afar to enter the spirit world, but rather round one bend in the forest, and lo and behold, there were the thunder beings or a speaking eagle to mark the beginning of a totally psychedelic journey through the world of spirits. I'm reminded of the vision of the first humans as told in the sacred book of the Maya, the Popol Vuh, which, like the works and days of the Greek Hesiod, recounts a golden age of man, when, quote, perfect was their sight, and perfect was their knowledge of everything under the sky. When they looked, instantly they saw all that is around us, the sky, the earth, the lakes, the seas, the mountains, the valleys. But the Creator and the Maker said, they have known too much, and they clouded their sight. Though to some of us, hell-bent on viewing the world through the lens of the mundane, are likely to regard these stories as no more than superstitious assertions of uncivilized peoples, which bear no element of thought with which the modern scientific enterprise may benefit, this is a grimacing fallacy, and is in itself a superstition promoted by the failings of the Eurocentric ego and the hyper-rationalists, whose limited belief systems hardly allow for the experience of the bizarre to enter their world. I close this cursory and by no means thorough sift of the American Indian shaman with the words of Charles Eastman. The original attitude of the American Indian toward the eternal, the great mystery that surrounds and embraces us, was as simple as it was exalted. To him it was the supreme conception. bringing with it the fullest measure of joy and satisfaction possible in this life. The worship of the Great Mystery was silent, solitary, free from all self-seeking. It was silent because all speech is of necessity feeble and imperfect. Therefore the souls of my ancestors ascended to God in wordless adoration. It was solitary because they believed that He is nearer to us in solitude, and there were no priests authorized to come between a man and his Maker. None might exhort or confess or in any way meddle with the religious experience of another. Among us all, men were created sons of God and stood erect, as conscious of their divinity. Our faith might not be formulated in creeds, nor forced upon any who were unwilling to receive it. Hence, there was no preaching, proselyting, nor persecution, neither were there any scoffers or atheists. Thank you for liking and subscribing. You may find my sources for all of these accounts in the description. If you have any more stories of shamans or healers to tell, leave them in the comments. Consider supporting my work on Patreon or through a one-time donation with the links below in the description. Thank you.